It's been a year that takes a lot of energy, so it's nice to have remember that it's all out there waiting to come back to you and be turned on. Welcome. My name is Mitchell Stevens. I'm the co-convener of Education's Digital Future, which sounds very hubristic. I am the co-convener of Education's Digital Future. But in fact, all of us, whether we like it or not, are co-conveners of Education's Digital Future. How the revolution in digitally mediated technology influences how teaching and learning are conducted, experienced, organized, funded, governed, is really in large measure up to us. If it's not up to us, then somebody else will do the co-convening for us. But that is essential to the message that Roy and I and so many in this enterprise this year have been trying to convey. Roy couldn't be here this evening. He sends his best wishes. He has the academic's worst nightmare. He's not allowed to work. He can't work. He can't email. Can you imagine life without email? But he does send his best wishes to us from home. It's with mixed emotions that I convene this particular session because it's the final session of what has been an extraordinary journey certainly for Roy and myself and for a great many others. We began this enterprise hoping essentially to convene as broad and plural and open-ended conversations as we possibly could about what seems to us back in the summer of 2012 to be a very rapidly accelerating pace of change in the digital mediation of teaching and learning. Now, the digital mediation of teaching and learning is hardly new. It has been under construction as long as there have been digital media. And one of the things that Roy and I and the class have been trying to recover is the, in fact, very rich history, technological, intellectual, political, organizational, of this moment. Although it seems that, I don't know how one would measure velocity of change, but it does seem to many of us that the pace and urgency of discourse about what is happening through the vehicles of digital media and those various parties who are interested in having those media reorganize the life world of learning seems to have become much faster in the last 12 months. Certainly, those conversations, which have been vital at Stanford for some time, have become part of the main business of this university in ways that offer a tremendous opportunity for those of us who are interested in understanding and sometimes encouraging the possibilities that are brought about by the technologies of this moment. So it's like any conclusion. It feels there's a little bit of ennui in welcoming you here this evening. I want to thank not only the Claude Steele and the various staff and administrators who we have made a point of thanking by name in the past, but I want to focus my gratitude this evening on the students. I was going to say students and fellow travelers because we've had a lot of people who aren't technically, according to the registrar, students, but all of us in a sense have been students of this enterprise who have been part of this conversation over the course of the whole year. And that's one of the things that I'm most proud of, I would say, is that we are convening not only very good discussions, but we are providing our visitors with I think, a very sophisticated audience. And we have done a lot together, and I appreciate your seriousness of purpose over the course of this year. There are two pieces of good news. The first piece of good news is that if you want, you get to come on and do it all over again, and it's in a different way next year. Claude Steele, the GSE dean, strongly encouraged Roy and I to convene an instance of EDF next year. And we also, and joining that faculty team will be Candace Till, Thille. I won't say much about her, but you probably have some sort of device in front of you, and you can Google her if you like. And Candace joining the faculty of the Graduate School of Education is very good news for pretty much anyone who's interested in open education resources and who is interested in having us have as much intellectual and technical capacity as we can at this university regarding digital media. So she'll be joining the faculty team. There will, of course, be many doctoral students involved once again. I will name the doctoral students and the postdocs, though, who have been so faithful and brought so much to our enterprise. Laura Moorhead, tweeting as we speak, and Daniel Green, who is, among other things, he would be dreaming up your next Piazza assignment, but not this time. If you're enrolled in the class, you have one more Piazza assignment that's due before the conclusion of the course. And we're basically going to ask you for your input on what worked and what didn't work and what you would hope to have us continue and change going forward. Okay? And Abby Larson, the postdoc, who has held the entire enterprise together. Oh, what the heck. And Heap Ho, who's done a lot of great tech work for us, and Paul, Michael, David, who's back there somewhere, and Sean is here somewhere, right there, yes, and, oh gosh, who else? Rebecca Smith, and Holly Materman, and Johanna Mansour, and all sorts of people. This was a highly distributed enterprise. I'm sure I left some people off the list. One thing that we won't have a class next year in terms of the one unit course that goes through the entire year. Instead of having that structure, Roy and I will be both offering classes ourselves, academic courses, full credit courses ourselves, and courting some colleagues to tie courses that they believe are intellectual cognates of our enterprise, and listing those courses as part of education's digital future. And as often as possible, making those courses porous for participants of various kinds. So, for example, in fall 2013, on Tuesday evenings, I will be teaching a class, Education 355, Higher Education and Society, which is essentially a political economy of higher education, primarily in the United States, but has a global comparative component. And you can register for that class if you like, but each and every one of those sessions will be open to the general public, and I will publicize the syllabus and the readings and the content, so if there are things that are going on the syllabus that you think would be interesting, you'll just be welcome to come. I won't ask my colleagues to do exactly the same thing, but the basic idea is that we're trying to essentially deepen the intellectual opportunities that we seeded with education's digital future. Okay, so stay tuned for those possibilities. And you can expect another series of public forums like this one at the rate of about 2 per quarter. So we will continue to feed you a couple of times each term. Okay? What else should I say? Any other announcements before we shift over? Oh, the other piece of good news. We've got a great panel. We've got a great panel tonight. And I'm using the word thrill a lot this year, I'm finding. But a true thrill for me is I'm a sociologist, a student of universities and organization. I am not from the same intellectual universe as my colleagues in the learning sciences. But now I get to be part of their intellectual universe, at least to some sense. And I'm learning a great deal in that process. So, but I'm hardly in the right position to introduce this panel. Thankfully, my colleague Paolo Blickstein will do that for us. And I'll get the rest of the night off. Paolo is assistant professor at the Graduate School of Education. He often lives right over here, and he often has students from all over the Bay Area region doing cool stuff in our lobby, really cool stuff in our lobby. He does research and design about how students learn in radically hands-on environments. I like that phrase, radically hands-on, such as fab labs, which he can tell you about, and maker spaces with robotics, 3D printers, and the like. and how to improve instruction in science and math using these tools. He also does research on multimodal learning analytics and new assessments for project-based learning. Hello.
Thanks, Mitchell. So we talked about if I should do intro to the panel first or the bios first, but I forgot which one, so I have to ask. Bios first? Or? Okay. So I do the intro. Huh? Panel first. Yeah. Panel. Okay. Okay, so I'll introduce the panel first. Is that okay? Okay. So, well, first, Mitchell, thanks for inviting me to host the panel. I've known Bridget and Nicole for many years, and so it's really great to be able to do this. So, Bridget Barron, and many of you might know her. She's a professor here, associate professor at Stanford, and she directs the Youth Lab research group. She studies social processes of learning in and out of school. In a 5-year NSF-supported career award, she documented adolescents' learning ecologies for technological fluency development. And she used longitudinal methods to document the evolution of interest-based learning activities such as game design, robotics, digital movie making, mapping children's learning to reveal the networks of partners and resources that have supported learning in and out of school. Most recently, she is investigating the development of expertise and motivation among middle school students learning to become citizen scientists. So, first panel member. Second one is Nicole Pinkard. She holds a BS in computer science from Stanford and a master's and PhD in the learning sciences from Northwestern University. She's an associate professor in the College of Computing and Digital Media at DePaul University and the founder of the Digital Youth Network and Remix Learning. Both organizations focus on developing digital literacies as tools for extending traditional literacies. Dr. Pinkard is also a co-founder of EU Media, a public learning space that immerses high school students in a context where they can make and produce new media artifacts such as music, games, and video. And finally, Elizabeth Supp is a senior producer and research director of Youth Radio, the Oakland-based youth-driven production company that serves as NPR's official youth desk. The Youth Radio stories Lisa has produced with teen reporters have been recognized with honors, including 2 Peabody Awards. With a PhD from Stanford School of Education, Lisa has written extensively about digital media and learning, and she co-founded Youth Radio's Mobile Action Lab, which was among the first projects worldwide in which youth partner with professional designers and developers to create mobile apps that engage their communities. So, thank you. And so I prepared a little intro to explain the ideas and that the panel will extend upon. But so it talks about literacy and digital literacy. So the idea of literacy not only as a workplace skill, but as a tool for intellectual empowerment and emancipation has been discussed in educational circles for decades, especially after the seminal work of Paulo Freire. Freire would famously say that literacy is important for reading the word and not just in the word. And because I'm not a native speaker, normally those are 2 things I say, I pronounce in the same way, but I guess you get, I've been here 13 years, I can't pronounce word, but I guess you get the idea. So this notion came back in recent years with the development of digital technologies. But what does it mean to be technologically literate? Unfortunately, the mainstream understanding of this idea is that to be technologically literate is to be a good user of machines, as if reading without writing could be enough. The scholars in this panel are all leaders in an intellectual movement that wants to make youth both consumers and producers of digital artifacts, digital media in particular. They reject the notion that the new technologies are just big, enormous word encyclopedia and a messaging system, and reminds us that digital technologies can instead be a new and powerful toolbox for personal and intellectual expression. In particular, the members of the panel have dedicated their careers to make some unheard voices heard, in particular voices of children in underserved communities. Using digital media in schools, libraries, radio stations, or community centers, they have empowered young people to create radio programs, movies, music, video games, and computer programs. They have also devised new and creative ways to research these activities, inventing new data collection and analysis methods, new forms of data representation, such as the technobiography, and shed light on the counterintuitive social dynamics behind these creative endeavors, showing that many of our assumptions about technologies and children are simply dead wrong. It's great to have them here to share some of their pioneering work with us today. So thanks, Bridget, Nicole, and Elizabeth.
Thank you, Paulo. That was a lovely introduction. So the images that you see on the screen behind me reflect emerging cultural images of contemporary teens, often referred to as digital natives. And this group is characterized by many things: being technologically immersed, obsessed with their social networking, their mobile devices, multitasking, but also they're characterized as being prepared in ways that older people are not to innovate and change their worlds with technology. And while it's true that time spent on mobiles or in gaming or in social networking is on the rise, studies that look at the depth and breadth of expertise in actually creating with technologies show that those youth who can do so are actually in the minority. And this raises important questions. So one, who's getting access to learning opportunities that develop capacities to create with technologies and adapt them for their own purposes? When and where is learning happening? And how can we bridge divides through intentional design? So my research group has been tackling some of these questions. We are particularly interested in digital hobbies that involve creating, designing, imagining new ways to use technologies for personal expression or to improve the lives of others. Things like making movies, doing robotics, programming games, making stop animation films are all things that we're interested in studying. We use a lot of different methodologies in this program of research. So we do comparative work, sampling communities that differ in their level of technological immersion. For example, Silicon Valley compared to other communities where fewer people work in the tech industry. We sample more and less intentionally designed ecologies that are intending to give opportunities for learning. And we do ethnographic field work, spending a lot of time doing deep case studies of young people and their families, and trying to use this qualitative work to come up with quantitative metrics, but also just to understand theoretically how we can account for learning. So a large part of the work is actually motivated by a desire, as Paulo said, to give voice to those young people who don't normally have our attention. But tonight, I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking instead about young people who actually come from affluent circumstances and who come from families where technology is part of the daily diet, where parents are working in the industry. And the reason for doing this is so that we can start to understand the development of expertise and how it's occurring across distributed resources. So in this particular study, we look closely at young people who are doing things, anything from web hosting to making movies to doing programming of games. We wanted to broaden our empirical scope for investigating learning from shorter periods of time. We normally try to teach something and test right away. We wanted to look over developmental time. And we also wanted to be able to account for learning across settings. So I'm going to share just a couple of examples. One of the young people that agreed to be a participant in our study, I will call him Craig, is pictured here on the far right in the green shirt. And he is sitting with Henry in the red and white shirt and another robotics team member. And they are, Henry is testing out a sensor that is attached to his eyeglasses that allow him to turn on and off anything with an on and off switch. Henry has limited mobility. Craig worked with 30 other kids for a year to create this technology for Henry. So our question is, how did Craig get to this point in time in high school where he was able to contribute this kind of innovation? And so looking at his pathway, he recalls a fascination with computing as a preschooler. When he was 8, he began playing with robotics kids with his father, who was an engineer. He took classes during the summer when he was 9 on web design and HTML. He became apprenticed to the church videographer when he was 11. This is actually interesting because he did this for 3 years, and he had to get up and be at church by 8 o'clock in the morning. And this was not something that was easy for him to do. It wasn't easy for his mom to do, but he chose to do that because he really appreciated the expertise that he was going to develop in digital broadcast. His grandfather hired him to build a website also when he was in middle school, and he learned how to do this mostly not only building on what he had done in a summer course, but through books and online forums. Looking at the resources at home, in his bedroom, he had 2 computers set up. One was a desktop, one was a laptop. Next to his bed were books on MS-DOS and robotics, Mindstorms, and throughout the house there were numerous technical resources that he had access to. In his school, he did have access to a public school that offered electives in programming, web design, and industrial technology, and he took all of those. He started a business also in middle school, creating and selling digital documentaries of music recitals that it was a contact through his sister. He joined the robotics club, and this was identified by his mother, but he was mentored by his father to overcome a lot of collaborative, competitive challenges that were in that club. So when we think about Craig's pathway and his learning, we really have to take into account a lot of resources. We typically, when we think about assessment, we think about assessing the knowledge that a person has. We less often think about assessing the quality and quantity of the resources that person's had access to. And so in this work, what we're trying to point to is the importance of doing that, as well as assessing learning. So just one other quick example. This is Layla. This is actually in high school. She's joined by others who won a competition, in a mathematics competition. Her story, she claimed to be bored by math until middle school, when she joined a team almost by accident. Once she got into this math team, her mother had, through contacts with other parents, found the artofproblemsolving.com, which is an online math forum that provides a lot of resources and access not only to mathematicians, but problem sets, contact with other children who are interested in math. And she became really involved in this community. She started a blog, she engaged in political discussion, and she deepened her commitment to the domain of mathematics. And she developed an interest in programming. The way that she describes her interest, actually, is she talked about people on the math forum knowing about programming, and she got jealous of them. They were saying things like, "What's your favorite programming language?" And they were talking about Fry's programming contests and stuff like that. So she pursued, at first, just free tutorials online. She wanted to understand more about this. She wanted to be in the know, so to speak. She also learned about graphics programs and did programming. And then at school, she also took advantage of all the electives that were made available to her. So if you compare Layla and Craig in terms of their over time learning opportunities, Craig actually has had many more years and a lot more opportunity to learn a variety of topics. But both of them have developed impressive levels of expertise by the time that they were 14, by the time they finished middle school. So when we look across all of our cases, those are 2 examples of particular cases in that study, we found that there was really wide variation in the age of onset of these kinds of creative activities. Some were playing with programming as young as age 5. Others started making and building when they were 11. That difference in the number of years actually does result in difference in expertise level. Interests led to the creation of new opportunities. This is something that is sort of a central part of ecological theory, but people change their own environments. And one of the things that we're seeing is that when young people become interested and passionate about a topic and they have access to the tools to learn, they often pursue their own activities. They also decide to form relationships, like in the example of Craig with the church videographer, that then actually create a new sustained learning opportunity. So this agency in learning is something central that we hope to pay more attention to and to look at as something that one could actually assess over time. In every single case, learning was distributed. Again, we're here in a school of education, we tend to think a lot about schools. But in these cases, school played one role, but there were actually opportunities that were distributed across virtual sites. Oh, dear. Where did it go? Is it back? Good. Yeah. Oops.
This is education's digital future.
There we go. Yes. Okay. So school, non-school environments supported expertise development. We found many pathways. This is also really important from a design perspective. There wasn't one place. It wasn't always home. Sometimes it was actually peer-based hobbies that led to an interest. Sometimes it was school, and sometimes it was home. So lots of places that can be seeded to develop interest and engagement. However, in this particular study, parents and their networks were central to understanding expertise. So we found that parents did all kinds of brokering, collaborating, teaching, providing resources, and coordinating the learning for their children. At the same time, we found a lot of variability in the breadth and depth of these ways of engaging with young people. So while we think it's really important to look at these average differences, you also need to attend to the variability because it's not just expertise, it's a lot about the relationship that parents and children have together. Okay, so the framework that we're trying to develop to account for this complexity, we call learning ecology framework, trying to understand learning as a system comprised of engagement with activities, resources, and people and relationships. We like taking a systemic kind of view because we can think about systems as being dynamic. They can change. They are subject to interventions. Changing something in one piece can have implications for other pieces. And we think that this kind of framework has not only descriptive and theoretical purposes, but also prescriptive and design purposes, as well as maybe even assessing equality of opportunities. So just to close, learning opportunities for making, creating hobbies are not equally distributed. We know that for sure. There's a lot at stake here, we think. We need the diversity of everyone's contributions as a source of innovation and creativity. We don't necessarily see this happening at the level that we would like to see. And that we think we can really focus on intentionally designing learning ecologies that catalyze interest and sustained engagement. Families always will vary in terms of what they bring to the mix. What we actually find is that all parents in all of the communities that we've studied are engaged and they're interested. They may not have the technical expertise or the resources or the time, but they are definitely a resource for their children's development. But we can build social networks across home, school, community-based organizations that can begin to bridge divides. And then finally, we have initial models and research that shows that if there is the will and the intention, we actually can create more equitable futures. And I want to turn it over to Nicole, because Nicole is actually one of the visionaries who's taken the lead in creating this kind of environment. Just want to acknowledge the whole research team and funders, of course. And Nicole, you're going to talk about the book.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm talking about. You can leave it there.
Okay.
Good afternoon. So I wanted to definitely start with showing the research team, because Bridget and I have worked together. While they started out as sixth graders and they're graduating from high school this year. So it's been long years. And so a lot of people worked to this. So I want to make sure, and some of them are here in the space. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge them. And we finally have a book that is coming out at MIT Press that follows our 3-year ethnography of looking at a group of kids from 6th grade through 8th grade and to see what happened, the impact of an intentional design, which I'm about to speak to a little bit. I also want to, I think I see Diana Joseph, who's here. Hi, Diana, who was a colleague of mine, who was actually the person responsible for getting me in Chicago to the University of Chicago to begin to do this work. So great seeing you, Diana. And here's my talk. Okay, so I'm going to pick up from Bridget's talk and give you a different side of the story. So Bridget started, her talk was focusing on students who come from more advantaged backgrounds, and I'm going to tell you a story from the opposite side, students who come from very much advantaged in some ways, but from the standpoint of how we think about socioeconomic or families with technology background, not so. But I would like to say that my curiosity with this question started here at Stanford as I'm from Kansas, and I think oftentimes when you're in well-resourced ecosystems, you're not aware of how much is at play that you think is you, that you're great and you're doing everything yourself, until you come to places and you come to spaces where you realize that person seems a lot like me, but their story is different. And so for me, that was working in East Palo Alto, where I was an undergrad here, and working with students who, before Dangerous Mind came out, you would see them in middle school and they were fine, and then by the time you see them in high school, they had chosen to drop out. And they didn't seem different from me. Conversations were the same. And so I always was wondering, well, what made it, and also connect that with the fact I was a African-American female computer science student here at Stanford, made me go, well, what was in the water that made it possible for me to do what I'm doing, and how can we figure out how to make more systems like that, or opportunities like that? So I'm going to start with Maurice. Maurice is now a senior who is graduating and going to Vassar next year. And I'm going to start with this is the technobiography of what was created with Maurice, our first interview with him, and to understand what was his interaction with technology before he started working with us. And Bridget had trained the team to go back and do these interviews. And what we see is across home school, after school, and in the community, very little experiences he had with technology. And the ones he had, you see the science CAD projects to design and things like that, we knew had taken place in the school, where Diana and I were fortunate to lead the tech work. So we knew that that was a reality. But student after student, we would see that there were very few opportunities. And what's also really important is up at the very top, you don't need to read the names, but you see very few people that were in his ecosystem who were actually helping him to think about technology. But through our work, over the years, Maurice developed very much an identity as a creator of digital media, and more so he viewed it as a tool to help him tell his story about social action. And he was definitely an activist, to the point that he actually even ended up creating his own. We had our own social network, but he thought that ours was a little lame. So he created his own social network platform for youth, and even started working with professors at UIC to help them understand how to use social networks. So this is the other side of his journey, and this is him through 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and where you see all of the ways in which we were able to integrate in school, after school, home together to create this learning environment and learning ecology, where what he learned in the after school in terms of how to do digital media had currency in the school day, also had currency with his friends. And he was able to take those skill sets and to take them out into community, which is the top level there, and to have impact on others. And what's really interesting, I think, connects to Bridget's work, is now look at the top and see all the people who are there, who he's both learning from and who he's also teaching. And so the story here is that, one of the stories, I'm going to show you another one in a second, is that I think it's possible. So the question isn't, is it possible to go into places like Chicago or East Palo Alto or Oakland and create kids who have the same profiles that look like kids in Silicon Valley? That's possible. We can do it. But the question is, how do we have to think differently about creating the ecosystem? Another example is a young man named Calvin, who is from day one viewed himself as a gamer. And I want to show you 3 quotes that him talking about himself across times, across 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and pay attention to the language of how he talks about who he is, and he was also involved in this program. So as a 6th grader, he considered himself a game head, and he said, well, I usually I work on here, he's talking about his computer, like different times, like Tuesday I was here up all the way to 6 o'clock just working on the video game. Everybody knows that I'd be on my laptop a lot and I'd be making games. So this is a 6th grader. It is one important thing to say that we working with parents implemented a one-to-one laptop program that the parents supported and paid for, which took away the access issue. So the access issue was there, but that still didn't necessarily address the issues of social capital and resources and things like that. So he did have the luxury to work on games at school and at home. In the 7th grade, he still calls himself a game head. And he's talking about being in the program. And he said, this is introducing something new. Instead of me just playing someone else's games, I could just make my own. The reason why I think this is a big project is because my dream would be to make video games when I grow up. And this is in 7th grade. And now as an 8th grader, in most cities, but definitely in Chicago, you have to decide where you're going to high school. And so you spend a lot of time now beginning to have conversations about what your career is going to be and what you want to do. And so you now see him begin to make a transition in his thinking. And so now he says, well, he's still a game head. He's going to stay a game head. But now he sees the relevance of that maybe for engineering. He said, well, I want to be the greatest engineer. And it's like, well, he says, well, when I apply for an engineering job, I will say I had 11 years with working with technology from middle school to college. I remember one of my friends asked, why do you want 11 years of technology? I just said, because I just need it. I just wanted to make a good foundation so once that foundation is finished, I can start getting a job. Then one day, maybe I will make history. So he's graduating from high school now, and hopefully he will be making history, and we're going to we're following all of them to figure out where their trajectories are. But I wanted to show these 2 cases to begin as we dive deeper in the conversation, because it's both about opportunities, but it's about how those opportunities oftentimes then lead to identities that we take on and that youth take on. And that those identities are accepted in the spaces that they're in. And so in this school, we were able to create a space where it's okay for him to be a gamer. It's okay for Maurice to really play around with and build social network spaces. And this is okay on the south side of Chicago. So much so that we almost had a situation where we didn't even have enough boys for the basketball team because it was giving up. Do I want to give up being in the digital media program, or do I want to play basketball? So oftentimes we tell these stories and we have the individual cases, but I think one of the really great things in working and collaborate with Bridget is that we had the ability to compare the students in Chicago longitudinally to the students here in Silicon Valley on a survey between across looking at the end of 7th, 8th grade sample. And so we had our group in Chicago, and then there was a group of kids in Silicon Valley. And if we took at the time in 2009, these would have been considered, if you did these activities, you were really considered a digital native, or many of these would probably change now. They might be commonplace. But these are 16 activities. And if you asked a kid, had you ever done them once? Had you never done it once or twice, 3 to 6 times, or more than 6 times? We asked this question to the kids in Chicago at the beginning of the 6th grade year, and then we ask them every year, but also we're going to show you a comparison at the end of the 8th grade year so we can see differences and changes. In terms of breadth, so had I ever done it once? Have I ever done it once? Of these 16 things, pre-6th grade, so before they got the intervention, only 4.58% of those things had they done, at least. So they had done something. And we can actually Diane and I can probably look at those and tell you which ones they were because we did them in school. At the end of 8th grade, of the 16 things, they had done 11 almost 5% of them at least once. So we had addressed the issue of exposing them to opportunities for them to find interest. But probably what's more important is if we look at which of the things they had done more than 6 times. So had they gone into depth with anything? And we see at the beginning of 6th grade less than 1, and at the beginning of 8th grade almost 4, which means 4 times 6, at least 24 projects they had done into some level of depth. And so that's at the end. So that's just looking at the kids in Chicago. That's not looking at a comparison to them. But when we look at the data and compare these students to the Silicon Valley sample, we see at the end of the 8th grade, we see the students in Chicago had the breadth score was was higher and significantly higher than the students in Silicon Valley. But we also see, which I think is interesting and surprising, is that the depth score is also significantly higher. And so this raises the question then, you know, when you see this, when you want to know why, what happened, what created the environment to do it. And so I want to turn a little bit to that in the time I have left. So Bridget talked about the parent, the roles. And so what one might go into thinking is that I think we would all agree that if your parents, or if my parents were a writer, you might imagine that they would play a lot more roles in teaching me to be a writer than they would teaching me to build robots, maybe. So if we're comparing kids to in Silicon Valley around the roles that their parents played in technology to kids in Chicago and the roles that their parents played in technology, we would expect to see a big difference. And also another important factor in looking at this is that the kids in Chicago were more likely to come from single-parent households. So when you look at the roles that parents play, you oftentimes might be talking about one parent as opposed to kids in Silicon Valley and 2 parents. And what we see is that on average of the kids, and there's 7 roles, or a combination of 14 roles if you have 2 parents. In Silicon Valley, parents play 10 of those on average, and in Chicago, the parents had played on 6. So there's a big difference. And so you say, well, it must not be the role of the parent at that point, because how did the kids in Chicago make up that difference if the kids in Silicon Valley have this the big difference? So part of it is it called us to work together to say, well, let's take the concept of parent out of the conversation, and let's just talk about who are the adults who are playing learning roles for us, and how does that come into play? And in that, if you ask kids the question, from Chicago and Silicon Valley, who were the, for where did you learn? Where did you develop your digital literacies? What were important for you? The kids in Chicago said the after-school program, which they attended, and I'll say a little more about that. And the kids in Silicon Valley said their fathers and or their mothers. So you see the tremendous difference. And so what we conjectured is that really is that the individuals in the after-school, which was made up of mentors, actually play the roles that the parents were playing. So while we don't actually have in this setting, we don't actually have a number to say the kids, and if you look at the mentors, they have on average 12 roles. We don't have that number. We do think for a future study, which we're trying to look at, is how do we actually quantify the roles that adults and peers can play who aren't the parents. And so the question is, I think the reality is we know that we can create these environments, but we have to think differently about who are the people who make them up. And so I want to quickly turn to, well, we can have the adults, we can have the technology, but what is it? What's sticky in the environment that makes kids want to engage, right? Because we can still create these spaces, but they might choose not to engage. And so one of the things we discovered very early on is that one of the things that digital media does, it changes the nature of audience. Traditionally, in most schools, your audience is yourself or your teacher. And so I have to buy into the teacher as, a valuable audience for me to go home and iterate on that work and to create that product. So if I don't value if I don't value the teacher's opinion, then I'm not going to actually do the work. But take one step over, and if I value my friends, if I value the opinion, if I value the opinion of the community, my peers who can see my stuff on YouTube, listen to my song on SoundCloud, read my stuff on the social network. Now I might iterate and I might develop that work, because at that point what I put out is connected to my identity. And so one of the things we discovered, or we really focused on in our work, is that what our goal is to help students understand what roles they want to take on, who do they want to be, and oftentimes that comes from what they see around them. What do they have to be able to create in order to take on that role? which means what are the activities, what are the lessons, what are the practices that they need to put in order to achieve that role. And so it's constantly a cycle: make the roles public, make the artifacts that represent those roles public, and then also help them do the activities. 3 books that are very relevant to this that help us think about outliers, which tells you the importance of practice. If you don't practice, you're not going to get better. The Talent Code, which I love, talks about context. And then if you haven't read Racialized Identities by Naila Nasir, it's a tremendous book because it talks about, which I'll end with this, that oftentimes the identities we choose to want to take on are the identities that are often unconsciously around the environments that we grow up in. And particularly the identities that are in school that we want kids to take on are oftentimes very different from the identities that they see on the everyday. So if we want them to take on these new identities as learners, that we have to be very conscious and make very clear what are the protocols and practices to make that happen. And so if we thought about, well, where does this take place in the real world? And there's examples of this all the time. And we see this every day as the basketball court, or any type of court, any type of music room, any type of dance room, where at any one point in time, my goal is to perform, is to be seen, is to have an audience, and to have that audience validate my ability. And what that means is that on the basketball court, what you have at any point in time is someone spectating, which lets me know what it means to get better. What do I want to get better at? Who's good at it? Who do I need to watch? An opportunity to practice. How can I practice my skills? An opportunity to perform, play a game, which gives me an opportunity to level up. And so on any court can be people playing at all of these different things. So it becomes a system that works around. And so we felt that we could do that in a school space by figuring out the relationships between schools, after schools, homes, and community by creating social networks, technology social networks, and human social networks that link all these spaces together. So what I do in the after school has meaning for in the school, which actually I can connect to at home. So I'm going to practice at home to get better. I'm going to develop my skills in the after-school context based on content that's meaningful to me. But you know what? My school is going to find it valuable in the school day and allow me to use my digital literacy skills connected to standards. And so we think when all this comes together, you create community spaces that value, that create the opportunities for Maurice and Calvin to be created. Thank you.
Thank you. What a great note to transition from. So I'm Lissa, and I guess I'm going to be talking about one environment in particular and then a range of other sites that fit somewhere, I think, in the ecosystem that Bridget and Nicole have talked about, and pivot our conversation maybe a little bit from a question of digital literacies and participatory cultures and how we leverage the activity and learning that can happen in those spaces and move them towards a notion of digital civics and participatory politics. So let me say just a word about sort of where I'm coming from in the work I'm going to present. So I do come from Stanford in terms of my intellectual home and base and foundation in my own training. It's always weird to come back to this place. It's like, you know, when you visit your family after you're a grown person and you sort of reattach to your childhood identity, and that's how I feel here. I'm like still a graduate student where I did my dissertation in that computer lab. But I want to talk just in these brief remarks before we open it up about 2 parts of the professional identity that I've carved out for myself and that inform the material I'm going to share. And the first part of that identity has to do with or emanates from my work at an organization across the Bay in Oakland called Youth Radio. And I'm actually just going to let this roll without sound to give you a sense of what happens inside this organization at any given afternoon on the corner of 17th and Broadway. And I'm just curious how many people think they may have heard Youth Radio on the radio. Cool. Nice. So what Youth Radio is best known for is probably where you heard it, youth-generated content for public media. And as was mentioned in the introduction, Youth Radio is NPR's official youth desk, though we've made a significant shift away from a broadcast model and towards a digital model for both generating the stories and distributing them to outlets. So at Youth Radio, we have young people from across the East Bay primarily come to our Oakland headquarters in the afternoons, and they learn transmedia in large part from their peers, as well as a faculty of professional media producer. Okay, so transmedia is storytelling across platforms, thank you. So, and this gets especially important for me to point out given our name, Youth Radio, which doesn't necessarily signal that it's not just audio. And really, if you think about how you interact with the radio stations that you listen to, the television shows that you watch, even the books that you love, more and more there's an expectation that that storytelling cuts across platforms and also invites co-participation and co-production from the people formerly known as audience, right? So that's kind of the spirit and the highest standard, at least, that we'll hold ourselves to in the tradition of transmedia. And an extension of that is a project that my then 19-year-old colleague and I, Asha Richardson, launched at Youth Radio in 2010, our Mobile Action Lab. So that's based on this principle that, or really this premise that it's not enough for young people to be telling those stories, as powerful as they can be. Hopefully, some of you had driveway moments where you sat in your car and you didn't want to turn the radio off and hear the rest of the story, and that's awesome. But that's still young people sharing a story through an existing outlet, using existing tools, circulating through existing platforms. And as more and more of young people's lives happen in relationship to one of these, we want young people to be the ones who are also programming tools and applications that are made available through their mobile devices that can help them to engage and transform their communities. So that's one piece of the work that I want to talk about. But the other piece is this research that I've been carrying out with colleagues really since I was here at Stanford. I finished here in 2000, and prior to that as well, looking at the relationship between youth learning, discourse, arts production in the spirit of Elliot Eisner's mentorship when I was here, and increasingly how digital media comes into play. And most recently, my research work has been associated with the MacArthur Foundation's Digital Media and Learning Initiative and a network that they put together of scholars and practitioners who are interested in what we're calling youth and participatory politics. So how we can pivot from participatory cultures, the kinds of engaged, enriched environments that Nicole and Bridget talked about, and say some of that activity can be turned towards a notion of participatory civics. And so the provocation of my little spiel here is that we really need to build a future for education using digital tools as well as face-to-face encounters and old-fashioned mentorship in order to support youth voice and agency in public spheres. And we know something about what kinds of environments give rise to these levels, these really deep and rich participatory cultures. 3 of those conditions that Henry Jenkins has talked about, he's a member of this network that I'm going to be representing here, are low barriers to participation. So the idea that somebody who even is a novice or newcomer to a field of practice has an opportunity to engage in a public and networked way. There's a mandate to connect and share. So, like Nicole was saying, it's not just a one-to-one, but it's a one-to-many, or in some cases a many-to-many relationship where young people are sharing their activities with peers and in some cases with elites and with institutions where they want to make an intervention. And that informal mentorship is something that powers that dynamic all along the way. So let me give you a concrete case of what I would say this kind of participatory culture can look like. The image that you see on the screen here comes from a project that happened at Youth Radio last year in partnership with the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, where the Kennedy Center made available to Youth Radio, some other organizations, including Nicole's, the original multi-track session of Marvin Gaye's iconic song, What's Going On, with the idea that young people would be invited to remix the song, number one, and then explore how do the central themes that Gaye introduced in that song in the early 70s still play out in urban America today. And so the group of young people that you see here are just 4 among a cohort of youth who kind of took on this project at Youth Radio and developed, among other products, a story for All Things Considered on NPR that was sort of the making of what's going on now. So I'm going to play a little bit of video here that just gives you a little bit of insight into both the process of making the remix and also what was at stake for the young people, how very seriously they took this charge and this opportunity.
I knew I had to come with it. Like, it's not only Marvin and a Marvin sample, but it's something we've been given to like revamp and make our own in this like day and age. So like I had to like, really grasp it and figure out how I'm gonna get all these thoughts into like a small little verse.
There's no pity in a city where fellas known to lose their life what's right, not really prone to choose.
22-year-old rapper Evan Childress wrote his verse about poverty in his hometown of Richmond, California.
No money for food, let alone some shoes. Get a crumb to use, find some bodies and some bones to bruise. Your opponents carry badges to flash.
Everyone with a trigger thinks they should pull it, and justice never comes for the ones hit by the bullet.
That's 18-year-old Rihanna Godfrey, one of my singers on the What's Going On remix.
On the front door saying sorry for your loss.
Marvin would be proud of the song, but I don't think he'd be proud of the fact that we have to keep asking for change. You know?
Yeah, it's like how long do you have to sing the song?
Right. Like how many remixes does What's Going On need until people like finally realize, oh, this is going on.
Yeah.
Now let's do something about it.
Yeah.
So now let's do something about it, right? I mean, that's the question. What is that? How can we do something about it? How do digital and social media play a role in that, as well as the kinds of environments that we've heard about that I'm sure many of you are involved in both studying and building? So to answer that question, I want to just touch on 5 tactics that we're starting to see in the research that I'm a part of that young people are using to express voice and exert agency in public spheres. And it sort of coalesces around a set of practices where young people are producing, investigating, and circulating information that's meaningful to them and their communities, that they're sparking dialogue, and that they're mobilizing concerted activity that will make a difference, like Rihanna said, for their own lives and communities. So the first tactic is what I'm calling creating content worlds. And this, actually, I'm so glad you asked the question about transmedia, because that's part of what it means to create a content world and not just publish a piece of work, right? Creating a content world means inviting others to enter the world, to have something to say, to transform it. There's a digital afterlife to that world, right? So it's not just you hear it on the radio and it evaporates. There's a way to engage and to take it forward. The example that you see on the screen comes from an organization called Youth Speaks, which some of you may be aware of, which has traditionally been a spoken word poetry organization for youth. Their big digital play right now has to do with how do we take issues like diabetes as a public health crisis and use spoken word poetry to provoke response, to work with UCSF to share information, and then to put out a call to action for other people to join in that storytelling project. So that's an example of how we create content worlds. The second tactic is pivoting your public. And this is an idea that has to do with the fact that, as we've heard, young people have these rich networks within their peer groups and around the interests that they share. And we're seeing more and more of them who are engaging in this participatory political activity, pivoting from those shared interests, whether it's fandom, whether it's some kind of music affiliation, whether it's just a friendship network, and being able to pivot those connections towards civic activity. An example, the iconic example, not the one that you're looking at on the screen, is Harry Potter Alliance. Has anybody heard of Harry Potter Alliance? Okay, cool. So it's an organization that recognized there is tremendous energy behind people who love the Harry Potter franchise. And there are themes within Harry Potter books that lend themselves to civic engagement. And so they take tropes within the books, like Dumbledore's army, and mobilize around marriage equality or getting out the vote. This one, who knows what this one's from? Anybody? Hunger Games, right. So this is a group of girls who had the idea to take themes within Hunger Games and pivot that public enthusiasm for this book series towards civic ends and equity issues. The third tactic is information foraging. So more and more, we've got these big data sets that young people have access to, that public agencies are making available, as well as their own social media networks as their own forms of data and news feeds. And we're seeing more and more young people finding and sharing information via those archives in ways that can really have impact in their publics. And this is certainly the closest thing to what happens at Youth Radio every time we do an investigative story. and share it not only through those traditional broadcast means, but also through their own peer groups. This image is from a really cool project, Map Your World, that is an open source application for Android devices that allows young people to create surveys, collect data, create really cool displays of that data, and share it with their community, including, in this case, raising awareness about water access issues in Calcutta. The fourth tactic, coding up. And so this is really what the spirit behind the Mobile Action Lab that I talked about at Youth Radio, and this idea that young people are increasingly a part of different kinds of groups and events that allow them to program tools collectively in the effort to advance public good. This icon is from Code for Oakland, which is one of many, many, many. As if you're anything like me, your inbox might be inundated with invitations to hackathons, which I could say a thing or two about, and have some serious questions about how far they can go. But they are opportunities for young people to come together with technologists, including young people who themselves are technologists, and program applications for social good. And then the fifth tactic that I wanted to hit on is what I'm calling hide and seek. And it's really based on what I think is the mandate to recognize that while we tend to privilege and get most excited about the most out loud, amplified, kind of sensational displays of voice and influence, that really part of cultivating that voice is knowing also how to strategically erase your tracks, or at the very least anticipate the risks that you might encounter by making yourself visible and traceable and searchable in association with different kinds of civic identities and activities. So the Dream activists picture here have been tremendously important, leaders in representing what's involved in how to kind of play that game. And this is a place where I would argue that adult mentors need to be there to absorb some of those responsibilities and risks as young people are playing in very high-stakes ways in association with these civic activities. And so just to, on that note, close with just a little bit of a sense of what are some of the risks involved in this notion of participatory civics, and how do we need to build learning environments, learning ecologies, and literacies that will support young people in maximizing the potentials and being aware of and minimizing the risks. Kony 2012, everybody's familiar with this kind of runaway video. It was at the time the most popular video ever viewed on YouTube, that was put together by an organization called Invisible Children, based out of USC's film school, or graduates of USC Film School, that was sort of a call to action to bring down a Ugandan warlord, and became phenomenally popular if you look at the number of views, but also tremendously controversial in terms of the ways in which it, in many cases, denied agency for Ugandan activists and citizens, as well as others in the region with expertise about what was really going on there, and taking on really a life of its own. So that digital afterlife kind of had a boundlessness to it, to use the words of my colleague Danielle Allen, that ended up, in some ways, many people would argue, taking away from the ultimate outcome of that effort and that movement. So I'm just, I don't want to take too much longer, but just recognizing that as young people are increasingly using digital and social media alongside their offline engagements, which I really want to emphasize, that education is digital future, in many cases involves face-to-face interaction, right? That there are these risks to simplify the message. So oftentimes we teach kids, when we do media literacy the old way, look out for the ways that your lives get simplified. Now they're the ones making the media, right? They're the ones hitting publish and not just submitting stuff to their teachers. So we need new literacies and new learning environments to support them in being able to complicate and nuance their messages. Slippage, as young people in their news feeds encounter messages from this movement or that movement or this effort or that effort, and it can become very easy to lose the historical specificity of different movements towards justice. So how do we kind of scaffold their ability to keep track of what are the forces in place in any given effort towards social justice, social change? I'm going to just close on unsustainability, because the others are pretty self-explanatory, and I know we want to open it up for questions, but I feel really strongly about unsustainability, because so often we get excited about different interventions. And this is maybe what circles back to the at that point, unarticulated critique of hackathons, which is that very often when we look at efforts to bring together young people and engineers, techies, they're in these very, marathon, high energy, one day, prototyping affairs that leave with people feeling really good that they just did something cool for their communities. But the sustainability of both the product of that activity and the relationships that need to be in place, as we've seen from this work, that whole top horizontal bar in your techno bios, where are those relationships? And we can do more harm than good if we put down interventions without a real plan for how they can be sustainable in education's digital future. Thank you.
Okay, so I will start with one question to the panel, and then we'll open up for questions. So the question is very, I think it's simple, and it's about the word digital. Mm-hmm. So there are multiple meanings of, there is digital as, let's say, a medium that, where you have bits, ones and zeros that can transmit information and all of that. But there are multiple meanings of digital as well. So there are like digital media, which is video making, radio making, and all those kinds of things. And I think since we live in a digital world and we use all kinds of digital tools, it's very easy to not really understand the differences between those different things. So, for example, watching a video on YouTube about math that is some sort of digital learning, but also creating a movie about some community issue that you have in your neighborhood. It's a radically different kind of activity, but they both digital in a way. So I think my question is about how do we tell those things apart, and if we need a new name or a new term or a better language to describe those different kinds of things.
I could start. This is kind of cheating because I'm just building off of what we've just presented. But I guess I'm thinking about a couple of words, or maybe 3 words: participatory, public, and this idea again that Danielle Allen has started to develop about a certain kind of boundlessness that, to me, get closer to capturing a quality of learning that we will often code as digital, but may or may not be digitally enabled. So to me, I'm much more interested in how do we start to identify and support environments where that kind of learning takes place, and to maximize digital tools to make them more likely to take place in higher quality and more equitable ways, than to actually go around and start coding levels of digitalness in different kinds of educational settings.
I think to add to that, oftentimes I think we have to complexify our language around digital media and learning nowadays. Oftentimes I think part of our work has been to develop students' digital literacies such that they can use digital tools to learn in other contexts. And at that point, the digital tools, almost you need them to fade into the background so they can really focus on the issues and the content that they need to understand. But then you have other tools such as a Khan Academy where you're actually trying to teach them within a digital context. And I think then you're looking at scaffolding and fading and the design of the technologies to support learning, where we are with online learning courses. And so I think we need a richer way of understanding what we mean by digital tools and understanding how they are also then always wrapped within a context of social practices, relationships, and expectations. So that using something like Khan Academy in one school might be a very different experience than using the same exact tool in an after school and in a home space. And so we can't understand the tool. It's not about understanding the tool, it's understanding the relationship between the tool, the context, and the expectations and social practices.
Well said. I
learned
think
it from you.
I think we've always had this problem with technology and education where people are wanting to locate a lot of agency in the technology. And we do believe that the way technologies are designed can differentially catalyze different kinds of interactional social processes. And so it is a funny tension because on the one hand, we don't want to throw out what's unique. And as we were hearing today from Lissa, there are a lot of very specific issues like digital afterlife. There's new kinds of powers and perils that technology brings. So on the one hand, we don't want to just wrap it up with literacy. We want to say something about what's unique, but at the same time, we want to keep it complex and realize that the technology is only a part of a much more complicated system.
Okay.
Abby's got a microphone.
Okay.
And we'll ask that you stand and introduce yourself when you make your comments or ask your question.
Hi, I'm Tim Riley. I'm a doctoral student here, and I'm curious about how much these youth contexts are ready to support them after they're finished with the programs that you've been talking about. So, how well do colleges and high schools and work opportunities recognize the capacities that are developing through their participation with these technologies, and are they prepared to market themselves or to demonstrate these skills in ways that other people, after they're done with this, are recognizing it?
I think Alyssa and I have a common approach where I think our work hasn't been about just giving students voice, but developing skills that they understand how to design within a set of constraints. So hopefully they can make use of those skills within jobs and careers. Mm-hmm. But to your point about whether, I mean, there's always, in different cities do different things in terms of the acceptance of digital skills and the use of digital skills as evidence of learning. I think there's one of the reasons we've seen a lot of movement around badging, this approach to try to bring badging, because first it can come with not just a recognition of a skill set, but also access to the pathway that leads to it. But I think more importantly over time is the evidence of the work that led to it, so that you can begin to just not say you have a certain skill, but let me see your work. Let me have a richness of conversation about particularly the digital badging. So I think we're nowhere near there yet, and we're actually really now beginning to see youth who are graduating. As we said, students we work with are now graduating from high school. And so now we're at the point where it is much more around, well, okay, so what? What does this mean for how do I begin to get into college? And then, more importantly, how do they understand how to tell the story of what they've done, and have we provided them enough of the portfolio of the work that they can take with them to be able to represent it? So that's why I think the badge work can play a potential important role.
Christopher Phillip. I'm the Director of E-Learning for the Climate Institute in Washington and for the Intertribal Council on Utility Policy at the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. And my question is actually to ask your advice about an experience we had with Dartmouth and Haskell Indian Nations University writing a grant for the NSF, in which I said every kid needs a tablet. They have to be able to have this thing to take with them and own and record their portfolio. We lost because of that requirement. And it seems like you won, and you think that that's a really good idea.
So I'm actually probably I'm going to give you an answer that you probably don't think I would give. So we did our work on the south side of Chicago, and what we did not do is buy computers for kids or families. We said, we can come up with creative leasing program, and we can figure out it's a fee that you can pay, but the parents paid their share. The school put in whatever they would have put in for the tech budget. And part of that was because we felt that it was essential that if it was something that was going to persist, sustainability, it had to be something that, when the kid left the program, the parents understood how they can continue this forward. And then we felt it had brought a sense of ownership. And then we didn't want to do anything that couldn't be replicated someplace else. And so from a technology standpoint, I look at, and one of the things we said was, if I see a pair of Nikes or if I see a PlayStation, then you can pay the $200 to have a laptop fee. And so we've had no problems in those situations. And of course, you have the context where you have to figure out the, for some families who can't. So to that, the cost, our grants of our work has always started from the standpoint that the communities are working together to provide the computational technology such that what we're adding is additive, and if the grant ends, the infrastructure is there to keep it replicable and moving forward.
The second part of that question I was also wondering about is, has anybody considered trying to link this lovely technology of learning all developed between the home, the school, and the after-school programs to say, this kid's got a portfolio that's going to be multi-year and multi-location, just like a lot of startups are saying, oh, your health records are not going to be able to follow you around anymore. They have an education record so that I, as a former 12-year high school teacher and a college teacher, could say, oh, this is what that kid is actually interested in.
We had some really nice forums on that, just so you know. Yeah.
Talk about the digital app.
No. I'm just saying it's part of our conversation. It's a really good question.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. I mean, just echoing the notion of badging is, I think, the closest thing to one kind of system-wide effort to do just that, with the Mozilla Foundation in particular, creating the technological infrastructure so that people can have what they call interoperable badges. So I think that's at least the aspiration, and we could have a really intense discussion about how close we're getting towards that goal. But the other sort of notion that has played for me in what you're talking about is this idea of digital afterlife, and just how much this material persists online in ways that young people can't always, anticipate or control, right? So that one of the things that we see in the case of a youth radio is we can see a group of kids making a story that takes months and months of work. We did a piece on child sex trafficking in Oakland that took months of work. There was tremendous youth development, health support for all the young people involved. We did a partnership with NPR, was on the front page of Huffington Post, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, tremendous resource investment. And then what happens in the comment stream, we have no control. I mean, we have very little control over, and that's hard-coded into that finished product. So when you talk about portfolios and the extent to which those portfolios are de facto retrievable already for kids who make their work public, but the portfolios are not just their own products, right? They're how their products spark different kinds of conversations that they may or may not want to be associated with. So it's just another complicating factor in terms of how we think about how young people package their work for other audiences.
Hi, my name is Meg Corton, and I work at Adobe. And the question that I want to ask all of you is, aside from cost, which I'm not going to talk about, what can the makers of these tools be doing, and what are the makers missing that could facilitate the entry and access for students to be able to take on these technologies and use them to tell their stories?
So cost is one. But we won't go there. But I think one thing you've done is, at least I'll say with Adobe, is you made the tools not to be web-based, cloud-based, and so because one of the goals is for kids to move across space and place. So I go work on a project at the library, and then I can work on it. I think the cloud-based is opening up all kinds of equitable opportunities for learning, where it's not like, only the 2 hours that I have it when I'm in my school computer lab. So I think that's a tremendous one. And then I think the resources that you provide, the just-in-time help resources, and along with curated galleries, so you know what's possible and what's doable. And y'all have done a lot of work with respect to that. So y'all are a leader in that space.
The only other thing I would say, and perhaps you're already doing this, since Diane is working with you now, is actually doing research on, are the things that you're designing and you're intending to bridge those divides, to make them accessible and taken up, are they actually working? And if not, what are the ways that you can think about designing places, points of access, whether it's libraries, whether it's working with families, whether it's schools, that would help those young people take up the tools that you're designing for?
And one last thing on cost, I think particularly for high-end tools, if there's a way in which you can have initial free access, but if you demonstrate you're developing and you're using the tool, that you can continue to have access, because eventually that person is going to get to the point and develop a skill set that they're going to pay for it. But oftentimes they can't get to that point because they, so it's almost like you earn access over
really
time,
cool
as
idea.
opposed to, we'll give you 3 months free, but you have to demonstrate that you've badged up or whatever, and then you can continue to get access, which I think helps you not say you have to give it to the whole world, but you're only really giving it to the users who are actually demonstrating that they're going to be future clients.
Is someone writing that down?
Yeah, that's a goodie.
And future teachers, maybe it's you earn your products when you commit to sharing.
And the only just quick thing also is just to take an active role in cultivating communities, like forums and communities of users. Like I know, like Scratch has done that. App Inventor's trying to do that, where they're not just hoping and waiting for that to happen, but they're actually seeding those conversations and building an infrastructure for it, so that your fellow power users become sort of advocates for getting better and better at those tools.
Hi, everyone. I'm not going to stand up because my back would be to most people back there. My name is Daniel Stringer, and I'm a PhD student here at the School of Education and a colleague of some of the people on the panel. So something that often occurs to me as I'm working with young people and helping facilitate activities for young people is the extent to which the experience of being a youth contains a lot of control by parents and other adults, particularly in terms of where you go, what you do, and who you interact with. And it seems like the programs that you all have been participating in with youth have potential to open up to youth the opportunities to bypass some of those controls in terms of communicating with people that parents may not know or even know anything about, or having a voice that at one point parents may have been able to keep from getting out there, but they can't anymore. So, and obviously for a long time, part of being an adolescent who grows up has been learning to navigate the process of interacting with the quote-unquote adult world. So how is it that these types of issues might have come up in the work that you all do, and how have you helped youth to navigate some of the new power that they may have as a result of these programs, and also how have you helped potentially parents and other adults to navigate that as well?
I would jump in on this one because I would but flip it, that it's also the most recent sort of moment that I would share is actually the opposite. It's one of my youth colleagues pushing back with me on this very issue, and me learning from her, really, which was I was working on a story about, so NPR had essentially commissioned a story from Youth Radio about that was based on these new data showing how much adults really know, or parents really know, about what their kids eat after school. And the survey data suggested that most parents believe they know almost everything there is to know about what their kids eat. And so NPR said to us, find out what's really happening here. So we did this whole story on youth snacking, and one of my youth colleagues, who's 18 years old, I know because I work with him every day after school, eats a lot of crap. And so and he's also really funny and awesome. And so we were like, oh, Dante, we should, and I wasn't, was another teenager doing the story. So I said, oh, talk to Dante, he'll be great. And so, so the youth reporter arranged with Dante to go and interview him and his mom after school about his eating habits. And my other colleague, Asha, sort of said to Dante, you better make sure your mom knows that she's down for doing this. It's going to be on the radio. And I was sort of like, don't talk him out of being in the story, we needed a character for the story. And she was like, look, I've had my parent uncomfortable in some cases with stuff I've shared on youth radio. You know what I mean? And so it's in some ways I'm answering your question by saying how important it is that we also really pay attention to the community's boundaries and the young people we work with, their boundaries around what they want to share, and really help them anticipate. And sometimes it takes their peers, as was the case here, to help them anticipate what it's going to be like when that story goes out there in a big way.
Hi, my name is Amina. I am a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley in the Graduate School of Education. So I actually have, I guess, a two-part question. The first is that, Nicole, I heard you use the word create twice in terms of like creating the identities of certain students. And so I want to know what do you think is the relationship between taking on an identity, creating an identity, and then making things, or digital making. So that's the first question. The second is that in terms of like students performing, and my question is about like when because Kafai talks about readiness to learn or readiness to do something, and I'm wondering like when do students actually show readiness to actually perform or to take on these sort of identities in these public performances where people are spectating, and when are they hesitant about that? You know what I mean? With people watching them do these things, and also what is the parent's role in that? Because I know the idea, especially for more affluent parents, is that they may push you into becoming an engineer because that's what they did, as opposed to maybe this is something that you are inclined to do. So I guess it's about when would a kid be more ready?
Great questions. I can't wait to read your
You're allowed to
dissertation.
jump in.
I'll say to the performance, and Paulo definitely to the identity stuff. To the performance, so I think it depends on big P performance or small P performance, and creating spaces where you're constantly performing, but it doesn't. It's like really, what is the what's the right word? What is the opportunity for when you feel more comfortable? The size of the audience, who is the audience, the risk factor. So one of the things we've done in using our own social networks, our private social networks, where students know each other, they're sharing in that space. But then there's opportunity to share outside of that space, share more publicly. And so we don't like take kids from, I'm just doing my stuff and no one ever sees it, and now, go get on the stage with John Legend at the Kennedy Center. There's a growth process to there such that you feel that you can step into that, and that any point in time performance should be something that you choose to do. But I do think it becomes a complexified issue when you think about the use of online tools, because oftentimes things are public, and you're in taking it back is a little difficult. So we try to we just try to create multiple layers, multiple levels of when I share, but also to make very clear the quality that you need in order to be able to share. Right, so I used the John Lennon. We both had students on the What's Going On. It wasn't someone who had just decided to do a song the first time ever who ended up on the stage with John Legend. It was students who had worked over time and had developed a skill set. And I think one of the problems we sometimes have in the digital space is that you can get your stuff out there, and sometimes students don't understand the level of iteration and revision that they need to do. And so it's upon us to make sure that we provide access to differential performance spaces, and that they understand the work they have to put in to get to the next space.
And if you look at some of the casework we did in Nicole's school, so we definitely have cases where, and this was more true for some of the young women who were really hesitant. They did not necessarily want to be performing, and then they were actually much more comfortable being under the radar, not necessarily showing off what they had done. In fact, sometimes the research team learned about things that they were doing before any of the mentors. And it was in part, because we were systematically asking, but it was also the case that they really didn't feel the need to be public. At the same time, we have examples of developing relationships with mentors that over a 3-year period went from very shy and private to being very articulate about the desire to speak more broadly into a community. And so that process of scaffolding and self-definition as somebody who actually has something to share over time when they feel comfortable is important to acknowledge, not just those who jump immediately into the spotlight.
I just want to make a quick comment that oftentimes in those spaces, especially when kids are working in groups, even if they are using new tools and all of that, they tend to self-organize based on their previous identity and ability. So one of the big dangers of this is that, as you do more and more of those kinds of activities, kids that are, they think, oh, I'm not a technology person. So they end up doing like the clothes or the kind of sign to put on the wall and all of that. And so, for example, we are working with a group of kids doing e-textiles, which are like this kind of robotic things you put on clothes. and then we had groups of 2 males and 2 females, and then we, after 2 days we realized that the females were doing all the like sewing and all of that, and the guys were doing all the electronics, right? So that's not a good dynamic. And we find that as educators, you need to design interventions that kind of displace people from their comfort zone and put them in places where they have to actually do things they're not used to, because people, they want to be seen as competent, so they tend to work on things they are confident they will do well. So we have to take them out of that mode. And
to add, one of the things we learned in our work when we were looking at girls in programming, that when we couldn't necessarily get the girls into the programming after school pod, and I'm like, wait a second, you need girls in after school programming pod. But when we made it a requirement for class, then the girls they did it, and they because their expectation was they were going to do what the requirements were. And so we actually thought some of them that they only did it the class project and then they left it alone. But what we found out, and some of them we were able to keep together in a little cohort, but many of them had gone home, and because they had the technology at home, were creating all kinds of games, and they weren't sharing, and that we found out with the data, with the interview. So I think there's interesting to understand the different constraints, and because what they said is we don't want to go into the game pod where there's all these 6th grade boys, and it's boy culture, and then you're the question of, well, do I create 2 separate ones, or and so they chose not to opt out in that space, but the classroom space was a space where they could actually engage the gaming first because they felt they had to, and it wasn't the same type of dynamic. So really figuring out the affordances of different spaces, and that they're more comfortable to try on identities that that they then might decide they like, and then they might choose to explore them not in your traditional paths, but in other ways.
One other thing, just to say quickly, so part of the story of the research is trying to really unpack what mentors were doing. And so we identified 5 or 6 different strategies that mentors would take on, including Nicole, who was a mentor as well as designer. So inviting participation very specifically, to recruit the participation of people who were on the sidelines was one way, doing a lot of work to identify interests and to build supportive environments and to keep connecting with them. Anyway, it's all in the book.
I guess I know it. Well, just because I totally hear you guys, and I've been involved in and thought about a lot of that stuff, but I also just personally would be curious what folks think, and I don't know if we have time to really get into it, but just about the value of allowing for specialization at a certain point. So some of the models that I'm most inspired by are those that really do all of those creative and intentional interventions that you're talking about, but they'll also acknowledge that at a certain point when you really are getting a kind of expertise, that it's okay to lean into the thing that you love the most, and that you're the best at. And because really it's a collective that's producing something, and so it's kind of owning what your role is within the collective.
Well,
so.
So definitely, I think we want kids to find what they're interested in. But one of the things at least in the communities we work with, is oftentimes all they know is what they want to come and be in the rapper. They want to come and being the person in front of the screen. They don't know that there's an editor. They don't know that there's all these other things. And so you need to sort of put them in spaces where they get to experience the different roles. And what we've seen is that over time, everyone filters out to different spaces. Yeah. So even in film, I really want to be the camera person. I want to be the editing. And we've seen middle school is the place where we want them to experience. And then we've seen normally in high school is where they decide that this is where my lane is and I'm going to go down this particular lane. But because they've had to experience it, they can then, I think, in more ways engage with others. Yeah. Because they had to play some of those different.
All right, enough. Okay. Just enough. Wow, that was really something else. Thanks to all 3 of you and all 4 of you for a terrific evening. Let's give them a hand, and then I'll make some announcements. 3 quick announcements. One is thanks to Heap, Ho, and colleagues in IT, a digital capture, modestly edited, of this evening will be available online soon. So keep an eye out there if you want to hear more or share. Tomorrow Wednesday at 4 p.m. in the Stanford Humanities Center. Find me afterwards if you want to learn more. Jace Kohlmeyer, who's the lead data scientist at Khan Academy, is giving a talk sponsored by our close friends in the Vice Provost of Online Learning's office. 4 to 5 should be standing room only, so get there early if you want to sit down. And we will continue over the course of the summer. We won't have programming in the summer, but we will keep our website fresh. So, and we're trying to make that a living resource for news and views, as we used to say, of digital learning. And if you just can't wait for our programming next year, and you want to watch reruns, you can go to the EDF website. And one of my own favorite features of the website is each and every class, just about every class, has a short synoptic paragraphs written by Daniel Green and Laura called "What Happened in Class," and you can get a sense of the conversation that we've been having over the entire year. And it's in those dates that you can find digital captures of the other public forums. So make use of those resources if you'd like. Thanks again, and we'll see you around campus.